Section 2 of the works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Lectures, Dresden edition, published 1900. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 4, Why I Am an Agnostic, Part 2. Having spent my youth in reading books about religion, about the new birth and disobedience of our first parents, the atonement, salvation by faith, the wickedness of pleasure, the degrading consequences of love, and the impossibility of getting to heaven by being honest and generous, and having become somewhat weary of the frayed and raveled thoughts, you can imagine my surprise, my delight, when I read the poems of Robert Burns. I was familiar with the writings of the devout and insincere, the pious and petrified, the pure and heartless. Here was a natural, honest man. I knew the works of those who regarded all nature as depraved, and looked upon love as the legacy and perpetual witness of original sin. Here was a man who plucked joy from the mire, made goddesses of peasant girls, and enthroned the honest man. One whose sympathy with loving arms embraced all forms of suffering life, who hated slavery of every kind, who was as natural as heaven's blue, with humor kindly as an autumn day, with wit as sharp as Ithuriel's spear, and scorn that blasted like a simoon's breath. A man who loved this world, this life, the things of every day, and placed above all else the thrilling ecstasies of human love. I read and read again with rapture, tears, and smiles, feeling that a great heart was throbbing in the lines. The religious, the lugubrious, the artificial, the spiritual poets were forgotten and remained only as fragments, the half-remembered horrors of monstrous and distorted dreams. I had found at last a natural man, one who despised his country's cruel creed, and was brave and sensible enough to say, all religions are old wives' fables, but an honest man has nothing to fear, either in this world or the world to come. One who had the genius to write Holy Willie's Prayer, a poem that crucified Calvinism and through its bloodless heart thrust the spear of common sense, a poem that made every orthodox creed the food of scorn, of inextinguishable laughter. Burns had his faults, his frailties. He was intensely human. Still, I would rather appear at the judgment seat drunk and be able to say that I was the author of A Man's a Man for a That, than to be perfectly sober and admit that I had lived and died a Scotch Presbyterian. I read Byron, read his Cain, in which, as in Paradise Lost, the devil seems to be the better God, read his beautiful, sublime, and bitter lines, read his Prisoner of Chillon, his best, a poem that filled my heart with tenderness, with pity, and with an eternal hatred of tyranny. I read Shelley's Queen Mab, a poem filled with beauty, courage, thought, sympathy, tears, and scorn, in which a brave soul tears down the prison walls and floods the cells with light. I read his Skylark, a winged flame, passionate as blood, tender as tears, pure as light. I read Keats, whose name was writ in water, read St. Agnes' Eve, a story told with such an artless art that this poor common world is changed to fairyland, the Grecian urn that fills the soul with ever-eager love, with all the rapture of imagined song, the nightingale, a melody in which there is a memory of morn, a melody that dies away in dusk and tears, paining the senses with its perfectness. And then I read Shakespeare, the plays, the sonnets, the poems, read all. I beheld a new heaven and a new earth. Shakespeare, who knew the brain and heart of man, the hopes and fears, the loves and hatreds, the vices and the virtues of the human race, whose imagination read the tear-blurred records, the blood-stained pages of all the past, and saw falling athwart the outspread scroll the light of hope and love. Shakespeare, who sounded every depth, while on the loftiest peak there fell the shadow of his wings. I compared the plays with the inspired books, Romeo and Juliet with the Song of Solomon, Lear with Job, and the sonnets with the Psalms, and I found that Jehovah did not understand the art of speech. I compared Shakespeare's women, his perfect women, with the women of the Bible. I found that Jehovah was not a sculptor, not a painter, not an artist, that he lacked the power that changes clay to flesh, the art, the plastic touch that molds the perfect form, the breath that gives it free and joyous life, the genius that creates the faultless. The sacred books of all the world are worthless dross and common stones compared with Shakespeare's glittering gold and gleaming gems. Up to this time I had read nothing against our blessed religion except what I had found in Burns, Byron, and Shelley. By some accident I read Volney, who shows that all religions are and have been established in the same way, that all had their Christs, their apostles, miracles, and sacred books, and then asked how it is possible to decide which is the true one, a question that is still waiting for an answer. I read Gibbon, the greatest of historians, who marshaled his facts as skillfully as Caesar did his legions, and I learned that Christianity is only a name for paganism, for the old religion shorn of its beauty, that some absurdities had been exchanged for others, that some gods had been killed, a vast multitude of devils created, and that hell had been enlarged. And then I read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. Let me tell you something about this sublime and slandered man. He came to this country just before the Revolution. He brought a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, at that time the greatest American. In Philadelphia, Paine was employed to write for the Pennsylvania Magazine. We know that he wrote at least 5 articles. The first was against slavery, the second against dueling, the third on the treatment of prisoners, showing that the object should be to reform, not to punish and degrade, the fourth on the rights of women, and the fifth in favor of forming societies for the prevention of cruelty to children and animals. From this you see that he suggested the great reforms of our century. The truth is that he labored all his life for the good of his fellow men, and did as much to found the great republic as any man who ever stood beneath our flag. He gave his thoughts about religion, about the blessed scriptures, about the superstitions of his time. He was perfectly sincere, and what he said was kind and fair. The Age of Reason filled with hatred the hearts of those who loved their enemies, and the occupant of every orthodox pulpit became, and still is, a passionate maligner of Thomas Paine. No one has answered, no one will answer, his argument against the dogma of inspiration, his objections to the Bible. He did not rise above all the superstitions of his day. While he hated Jehovah, he praised the God of nature, the creator and preserver of all. In this he was wrong, because, as Watson said in his reply to Paine, the God of nature is as heartless, as cruel as the God of the Bible. But Paine was one of the pioneers, one of the Titans, one of the heroes who gladly gave his life, his every thought and act to free and civilize mankind. I read Voltaire. Voltaire, the greatest man of his century, and who did more for liberty of thought and speech than any other being, human or divine. Voltaire, who tore the mask from hypocrisy and found behind the painted smile the fangs of hate. Voltaire, who attacked the savagery of the law, the cruel decisions of venal courts, and rescued victims from the wheel and rack. Voltaire, who waged war against the tyranny of thrones, the greed and heartlessness of power. Voltaire, who filled the flesh of priests with the barbed and poisonous arrows of his wit, and made the pious jugglers who cursed him in public laugh at themselves in private. Voltaire, who sided with the oppressed, rescued the unfortunate, championed the obscure and weak, civilized judges, repealed laws, and abolished torture in his native land. In every direction this tireless man fought the absurd, the miraculous, the supernatural, the idiotic, the unjust. He had no reverence for the ancient. He was not awed by pageantry and pomp, by crowned crime or mitred pretense. Beneath the crown he saw the criminal, under the mitre the hypocrite. To the bar of his conscience, his reason, he summoned the barbarism and the barbarians of his time. He pronounced judgment against them all, and that judgment has been affirmed by the intelligent world. Voltaire lighted a torch and gave to others the sacred flame. The light still shines and will as long as man loves liberty and seeks for truth. I read Zeno, the man who said, centuries before our Christ was born, that man could not own his fellow man. No matter whether you claim a slave by purchase or capture, the title is bad. They who claim to own their fellow men look down into the pit and forget the justice that should rule the world. I became acquainted with Epicurus, who taught the religion of usefulness, of temperance, of courage and wisdom, and who said, "Why should I fear death? If I am, death is not. If death is, I am not. Why should I fear that which cannot exist when I do?" I read about Socrates, who, when on trial for his life, said, among other things, to his judges these wondrous words, quote, "I have not sought during my life to amass wealth and to adorn my body, but I have sought to adorn my soul with the jewels of wisdom, patience, and above all, with a love of liberty." End quote. So I read about Diogenes, the philosopher who hated the superfluous, the enemy of waste and greed, and who one day entered the temple, reverently approached the altar, crushed a louse between the nails of his thumbs, and solemnly said, quote, "The sacrifice of Diogenes to all the gods." End quote. This parodied the worship of the world, satirized all creeds, and in one act put the essence of religion. Diogenes must have known of this inspired passage, quote, "Without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sins." End quote. I compared Zeno, Epicurus, and Socrates, three heathen wretches who had never heard of the Old Testament or the Ten Commandments, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, three favorites of Jehovah, and I was depraved enough to think that the pagans were superior to the patriarchs, and to Jehovah himself. My attention was turned to other religions, to the sacred books, the creeds and ceremonies of other lands, of India, Egypt, Assyria, Persia, of the dead and dying nations. I concluded that all religions had the same foundation, a belief in the supernatural, a power above nature that man could influence by worship, by sacrifice and prayer. I found that all religions rested on a mistaken conception of nature, that the religion of a people was the science of that people, that is to say, their explanation of the world, of life and death, of origin and destiny. I concluded that all religions had substantially the same origin, and that, in fact, there has never been but one religion in the world. The twigs and leaves may differ, but the trunk is the same. The poor African that pours out his heart to his deity of stone is on an exact religious level with the robed priest who supplicates his God. The same mistake, the same superstition, bends the knees and shuts the eyes of both. Both ask for supernatural aid, and neither has the slightest thought of the absolute uniformity of nature. It seems probable to me that the first organized ceremonial religion was the worship of the sun. The sun was the sky father, the all-seeing, the source of life, the fireside of the world. The sun was regarded as a god who fought the darkness, the power of evil, the enemy of man. There have been many sun gods, and they seem to have been the chief deities in the ancient religions. They have been worshipped in many lands, by many nations, that have passed to death and dust. Apollo was a sun god, and he fought and conquered the serpent of night. Buldar was a sun god. He was in love with the dawn, a maiden. Krishna was a sun god. At his birth the Ganges was thrilled from its source to the sea, and all the trees, the dead as well as the living, burst into leaf and bud and flower. Hercules was a sun god, and so was Samson, whose strength was in his hair, that is to say, in his beams. He was shorn of his strength by Delilah, the shadow, the darkness. Osiris, Bacchus, and Mithra, Hermes, Buddha, and Quetzalcoatl, Prometheus, Zoroaster, and Perseus, Kadam, Lao Tse, Fohi, Horus, and Ramses were all sun gods. All of these gods had gods for fathers, and their mothers were virgins. The births of nearly all were announced by stars, celebrated by celestial music, and voices declared that a blessing had come to the poor world. All of these gods were born in humble places, in caves, under trees, in common inns, and tyrants sought to kill them all when they were babes. All of these sun gods were born at the winter solstice, on Christmas. Nearly all were worshipped by wise men. All of them fasted for 40 days. All of them taught in parables. All of them wrought miracles. All met with a violent death, and all rose from the dead. The history of these gods is the exact history of our Christ. This is not a coincidence, an accident. Christ was a sun god. Christ was a new name for an old biography, a survival, the last of the sun gods. Christ was not a man, but a myth, not a life, but a legend. I found that we had not only borrowed our Christ, but that all our sacraments, symbols, and ceremonies were legacies that we received from the buried past. There is nothing original in Christianity. The cross was a symbol thousands of years before our era. It was a symbol of life, of immortality, of the god Agni, and it was chiseled upon tombs many ages before a line of our Bible was written. Baptism is far older than Christianity, than Judaism. The Hindus, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans had holy water long before a Catholic lived. The Eucharist was borrowed from the pagans. Ceres was the goddess of the fields, Bacchus of the vine. At the harvest festival they made cakes of wheat and said, "This is the flesh of the goddess." They drank wine and cried, "This is the blood of our god." The Egyptians had a trinity. They worshipped Osiris, Isis, and Horus, thousands of years before the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost were known. The tree of life grew in India, in China, and among the Aztecs, long before the Garden of Eden was planted. Long before our Bible was known, other nations had their sacred books. The dogmas of the fall of man, the atonement and salvation by faith, are far older than our religion. In our blessed gospel, in our divine scheme, there is nothing new, nothing original, all old, all borrowed, pieced, and patched. Then I concluded that all religions had been naturally produced, and that all were variations, modifications of one. Then I felt that I knew that all were the work of man. The theologians had always insisted that their God was the creator of all living things, that the forms, parts, functions, colors, and varieties of animals were the expressions of his fancy, taste, and wisdom, that he made them all precisely as they are today, that he invented fins and legs and wings, that he furnished them with the weapons of attack, the shields of defense, that he formed them with reference to food and climate, taking into consideration all facts affecting life. They insisted that man was a special creation, not related in any way to the animals below him. They also asserted that all the forms of vegetation, from mosses to forests, were just the same today as the moment they were made. Men of genius, who were for the most part free from religious prejudice, were examining these things, were looking for facts. They were examining the fossils of animals and plants, studying the forms of animals, their bones and muscles, the effect of climate and food, the strange modifications through which they had passed. Humboldt had published his lectures, filled with great thoughts, with splendid generalizations, with suggestions that stimulated the spirit of investigation, and with conclusions that satisfied the mind. He demonstrated the uniformity of nature, the kinship of all that lives and grows, that breathes and thinks. Darwin, with his Origin of Species, his theories about natural selection, the survival of the fittest, and the influence of environment, shed a flood of light upon the great problems of plant and animal life. These things had been guessed, prophesied, asserted, hinted by many others, but Darwin, with infinite patience, with perfect care and candor, found the facts, fulfilled the prophecies, and demonstrated the truth of the guesses, hints, and assertions. He was, in my judgment, the keenest observer, the best judge of the meaning and value of a fact, the greatest naturalist the world has produced. The theological view began to look small and mean. Spencer gave his theory of evolution and sustained it by countless facts. He stood at a great height, and with the eyes of a philosopher, a profound thinker, surveyed the world. He has influenced the thought of the wisest. Theology looked more absurd than ever. Huxley entered the lists for Darwin. No man ever had a sharper sword, a better shield. He challenged the world. The great theologians and the small scientists, those who had more courage than sense, accepted the challenge. Their poor bodies were carried away by their friends. Huxley had intelligence, industry, genius, and the courage to express his thought. He was absolutely loyal to what he thought was truth. Without prejudice and without fear, he followed the footsteps of life from the lowest to the highest forms. Theology looked smaller still. Haeckel began at the simplest cell, went from change to change, from form to form, followed the line of development, the path of life, until he reached the human race. It was all natural. There had been no interference from without. I read the works of these great men, of many others, and became convinced that they were right, and that all the theologians, all the believers in special creation, were absolutely wrong. The Garden of Eden faded away, Adam and Eve fell back to dust, the snake crawled into the grass, and Jehovah became a miserable myth. I took another step. What is matter? Substance? Can it be destroyed? Annihilated? Is it possible to conceive of the destruction of the smallest atom of substance? It can be ground to powder, changed from a solid to a liquid, from a liquid to a gas, but it all remains. Nothing is lost, nothing destroyed. Let an infinite God, if there be one, attack a grain of sand. Attack it with infinite power. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot surrender. It defies all force. Substance cannot be destroyed. Then I took another step. If matter cannot be destroyed, cannot be annihilated, it could not have been created. The indestructible must be uncreatable. And then I asked myself, what is force? We cannot conceive of the creation of force or of its destruction. Force may be changed from one form to another, from motion to heat, but it cannot be destroyed, annihilated. If force cannot be destroyed, it could not have been created. It is eternal. Another thing, matter cannot exist apart from force. Force cannot exist apart from matter. Matter could not have existed before force. Force could not have existed before matter. Matter and force can only be conceived of together. This has been shown by several scientists, but most clearly, most forcibly, by Büchner. Thought is a form of force, consequently it could not have caused or created matter. Intelligence is a form of force and could not have existed without or apart from matter. Without substance there could have been no mind, no will, no force in any form, and there could have been no substance without force. Matter and force were not created. They have existed from eternity. They cannot be destroyed. There was, there is, no creator. Then came the question, is there a God? Is there a being of infinite intelligence, power, and goodness who governs the world? There can be goodness without much intelligence, but it seems to me that perfect intelligence and perfect goodness must go together. In nature I see or seem to see good and evil, intelligence and ignorance, goodness and cruelty, care and carelessness, economy and waste. I see means that do not accomplish the ends, designs that seem to fail. To me it seems infinitely cruel for life to feed on life, to create animals that devour others. The teeth and beaks, the claws and fangs that tear and rend, fill me with horror. What can be more frightful than a world at war? Every leaf a battlefield, every flower a Golgotha, in every drop of water, pursuit, capture, and death. Under every piece of bark, life lying in wait for life. On every blade of grass, something that kills, something that suffers. Everywhere the strong living on the weak, the superior on the inferior. Everywhere the weak, the insignificant, living on the strong, the inferior on the superior. The highest food for the lowest. Man sacrificed for the sake of microbes. Murder universal. Everywhere pain, disease, and death. Death that does not wait for bent forms and gray hairs, but clutches babes and happy youths. Death that takes the mother from her helpless dimpled child. Death that fills the world with grief and tears. How can the Orthodox Christian explain these things? I know that life is good. I remember the sunshine and rain. Then I think of the earthquake and flood. I do not forget health and harvest, home and love. But what of pestilence and famine? I cannot harmonize all these contradictions, these blessings and agonies, with the existence of an infinitely good, wise, and powerful God. The theologian says that what we call evil is for our benefit, that we are placed in this world of sin and sorrow to develop character. If this is true, I ask why the infant dies. Millions and millions draw a few breaths and fade away in the arms of their mothers. They are not allowed to develop character. The theologian says that serpents were given fangs to protect themselves from their enemies. Why did God who made them make enemies? Why is it that many species of serpents have no fangs? The theologian says that God armored the hippopotamus, covered his body, except the underpart, with scales and plates, that other animals could not pierce with tooth or tusk. But the same God made the rhinoceros, and supplied him with a horn on his nose, with which he disembowels the hippopotamus. The same God made the eagle, the vulture, the hawk, and their helpless prey. On every hand there seems to be design to defeat design. If God created man, if he is the father of us all, why did he make the criminals, the insane, the deformed, and idiotic? Should the inferior man thank God? Should the mother who clasps to her breast an idiot child thank God? Should the slave thank God? The theologian says that God governs the wind, the rain, the lightning. How then can we account for the cyclone, the flood, the drought, the glittering bolt that kills? Suppose we had a man in this country who could control the wind, the rain, and lightning, and suppose we elected him to govern these things, and suppose that he allowed whole states to dry and wither, and at the same time wasted the rain in the sea. Suppose that he allowed the winds to destroy cities and to crush to shapelessness thousands of men and women, and allowed the lightnings to strike the life out of mothers and babes. What would we say? What would we think of such a savage? And yet, according to the theologians, this is exactly the course pursued by God. What do we think of a man who will not, when he has the power, protect his friends? Yet the Christian's God allowed his enemies to torture and burn his friends, his worshippers. Who has ingenuity enough to explain this? What good man, having the power to prevent it, would allow the innocent to be imprisoned, chained in dungeons, and sigh against the dripping walls their weary lives away? If God governs the world, why is innocence not a perfect shield? Why does injustice triumph? Who can answer these questions? In answer, the intelligent, honest man must say, I do not know. This God must be, if he exists, a person, a conscious being. Who can imagine an infinite personality? This God must have force, and we cannot conceive of force apart from matter. This God must be material. He must have the means by which he changes force to what we call thought. When he thinks, he uses force, force that must be replaced. Yet we are told that he is infinitely wise. If he is, he does not think. Thought is a ladder, a process by which we reach a conclusion. He who knows all conclusions cannot think. He cannot hope or fear. When knowledge is perfect, there can be no passion, no emotion. If God is infinite, he does not want. He has all. He who does not want does not act. The infinite must dwell in eternal calm. It is as impossible to conceive of such a being as to imagine a square triangle or to think of a circle without a diameter. Yet we are told that it is our duty to love this God. Can we love the unknown, the inconceivable? Can it be our duty to love anybody? It is our duty to act justly, honestly, but it cannot be our duty to love. We cannot be under obligation to admire a painting, to be charmed with a poem, or thrilled with music. Admiration cannot be controlled. Taste and love are not the servants of the will. Love is and must be free. It rises from the heart like perfume from a flower. For thousands of ages, men and women have been trying to love the gods, trying to soften their hearts, trying to get their aid. I see them all. The panorama passes before me. I see them with outstretched hands, with reverently closed eyes, worshiping the sun. I see them bowing in their fear and need to meteoric stones, imploring serpents, beasts, and sacred trees, praying to idols wrought of wood and stone. I see them building altars to the unseen powers, staining them with blood of child and beast. I see the countless priests and hear their solemn chants. I see the dying victims, the smoking altars, the swinging censers, and the rising clouds. I see the half-god men, the mournful Christs in many lands. I see the common things of life change to miracles as they speed from mouth to mouth. I see the insane prophets reading the secret book of fate by signs and dreams. I see them all. The Assyrians chanting the praises of Ashur and Ishtar, the Hindus worshipping Brahma, Vishnu, and Draupadi, the white-armed, the Chaldeans sacrificing to Bel and Hea, the Egyptians bowing to Ptah and Ra, Osiris and Isis, the Medes placating the storm, worshipping the fire, the Babylonians supplicating Bel and Merodach. I see them all by the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Ganges, and the Nile. I see the Greeks building temples for Zeus, Neptune, and Venus. I see the Romans kneeling to 100 gods. I see others spurning idols and pouring out their hopes and fears to a vague image in the mind. I see the multitudes, with open mouths, receive as truths the myths and fables of the vanished years. I see them give their toil, their wealth to robe the priests, to build the vaulted roofs, the spacious aisles, the glittering domes. I see them clad in rags, huddled in dens and huts, devouring crusts and scraps, that they may give the more to ghosts and gods. I see them make their cruel creeds and fill the world with hatred, war, and death. I see them with their faces in the dust in the dark days of plague and sudden death, when cheeks are wan and lips are white for lack of bread. I hear their prayers, their sighs, their sobs. I see them kiss the unconscious lips as their hot tears fall on the pallid faces of the dead. I see the nations as they fade and fail. I see them captured and enslaved. I see their altars mingle with the common earth, their temples crumble slowly back to dust. I see their gods grow old and weak, infirm and faint. I see them fall from vague and misty thrones, helpless and dead. The worshippers receive no help. Injustice triumphs. Toilers are paid with the lash, babes are sold, the innocent stand on scaffolds, and the heroic perish in flames. I see the earthquakes devour, the volcanoes overwhelm, the cyclones wreck, the floods destroy, and the lightnings kill. The nations perished, the gods died, the toil and wealth were lost. The temples were built in vain, and all the prayers died unanswered in the heedless air. Then I asked myself the question, is there a supernatural power, an arbitrary mind, an enthroned God, a supreme will that sways the tides and currents of the world, to which all causes bow? I do not deny, I do not know, but I do not believe. I believe that the natural is supreme, that from the infinite chain no link can be lost or broken, that there is no supernatural power that can answer prayer, no power that worship can persuade or change, no power that cares for man. I believe that with infinite arms nature embraces the all, that there is no interference, no chance, that behind every event are the necessary and countless causes, and that beyond every event will be and must be the necessary and countless effects. Man must protect himself. He cannot depend upon the supernatural, upon an imaginary father in the skies. He must protect himself by finding the facts in nature, by developing his brain, to the end that he may overcome the obstructions and take advantage of the forces of nature. Is there a God? I do not know. Is man immortal? I do not know. One thing I do know, and that is that neither hope nor fear, belief nor denial can change the fact. It is as it is, and it will be as it must be. We wait and hope. When I became convinced that the universe is natural, that all the ghosts and gods are myths, there entered into my brain, into my soul, into every drop of my blood, the sense, the feeling, the joy of freedom. The walls of my prison crumbled and fell, the dungeon was flooded with light, and all the bolts and bars and manacles became dust. I was no longer a servant, a serf, or a slave. There was for me no master in all the wide world, not even in infinite space. I was free, free to think, to express my thoughts, free to live to my own ideal, free to live for myself and those I loved, free to use all my faculties, all my senses, free to spread imagination's wings, free to investigate, to guess and dream and hope, free to judge and determine for myself, free to reject all ignorant and cruel creeds, all the inspired books that savages have produced, and all the barbarous legends of the past, free from popes and priests, free from all the called and set apart, free from sanctified mistakes and holy lies, free from the fear of eternal pain, free from the winged monsters of the night, free from devils, ghosts, and gods. For the first time I was free. There were no prohibited places in all the realms of thought, no air, no space where fancy could not spread her painted wings, no chains for my limbs, no lashes for my back, no fires for my flesh, no master's frown or threat, no following another's steps, no need to bow, or cringe, or crawl, or utter lying words. I was free. I stood erect and fearlessly, joyously faced all worlds. And then my heart was filled with gratitude, with thankfulness, and went out in love to all the heroes, the thinkers, who gave their lives for the liberty of hand and brain, for the freedom of labor and thought. To those who fell on the fierce fields of war, to those who died in dungeons bound with chains, to those who proudly mounted scaffold's stairs, to those whose bones were crushed, whose flesh was scarred and torn, to those by fire consumed, to all the wise, the good, the brave of every land, whose thoughts and deeds had given freedom to the sons of men. And then I vowed to grasp the torch that they had held, and hold it high, that light might conquer darkness still. Let us be true to ourselves, true to the facts we know, and let us, above all things, preserve the veracity of our souls. If there be gods, we cannot help them, but we can assist our fellow men. We cannot love the inconceivable, but we can love wife and child and friend. We can be as honest as we are ignorant. If we are, when asked what is beyond the horizon of the known, we must say that we do not know. We can tell the truth, and we can enjoy the blessed freedom that the brave have won. We can destroy the monsters of superstition, the hissing snakes of ignorance and fear. We can drive from our minds the frightful things that tear and wound with beak and fang. We can civilize our fellow men. We can fill our lives with generous deeds, with loving words, with art and song and all the ecstasies of love. We can flood our years with sunshine, with the divine climate of kindness, and we can drain to the last drop the golden cup of joy. End of Why I Am an Agnostic by Robert G. Ingersoll.